Okay, hello everyone. You should have just gotten the screen record in progress. So just so you know, today is going to be recorded. We've had lots of people who couldn't attend the book club but are interested in watching it later. So hopefully you all got that notice. And oh, I see some things in the chat where you're joining us from. If you'd like to add that, that's always interesting. So, thank you for joining us tonight. Again, my name is Jessica Kaplan, and I'm the horticulture manager here at the Conservancy. And we're so excited to welcome you to our second of three meetings of our Botanical Book Club. And tonight we are also joined by Jill Jonnes, the author of Urban Forests, A Natural History of Trees and People in the American Landscape. And as always, I have my copy here. So if anybody needs to reference a page number, you let me know. So first, let's cover some housekeeping again real quick. So this setup will be a little bit different. So everyone is automatically muted upon entering, which I'm sure you noticed. We recommend active speaker view for best viewing experience. The chat will be used. You should be able to talk amongst yourselves, and also the staff on the other side will be able to share any resources and information with you all. And of course, there will definitely be time for a question and answer with Jill after she gives her remarks. And if there's time, we can have some general book club discussion as well. So we'll move on to our book club agreements, just like we did for the last session. Give space, take space, hand raise, that is new this time. So during open discussion, please use your hand, and during the Q&A, please use the hand raise feature and you will be given permission to unmute. You'll click unmute and you'll be good to ask a question, make your comment. And please participate as much as you feel comfortable. We are so happy you're here and we want to hear from you. And also, please stay tuned for our final session of our book club series, which is on February 8th, next Wednesday. And we'll be joined by Emily Maxwell, the director of the Nature Conservancy's City program in New York. She will cover the kind of the current state of our New York City urban forest, as well as some of the work being done by a coalition called Forest for All NYC, of which many MSPC staff are involved. So we're excited to share that with you all. Okay, so we will move on here. So Jill Jonnes is the author of Eiffel's Tower, Conquering Gotham, Empires of Light, and South Bronx Rising, of which there is a newly updated third edition. So please check that out. She is the founder of the Baltimore Tree Trust. She's also a Maryland Master Naturalist, a staff member of the 2010 National Commission on the BP Deepwater Horizon oil spill and offshore drilling. She wrote the first chapter of the report to the President Deepwater, the Gulf oil disaster, and the future of offshore drilling. In the fall of 2011, she studied trees as green infrastructure at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars in Washington, D.C., and she has been a National Endowment for the Humanities Scholar, and that is just scratching the surface. So I think now, Jill, without any more delay, I will pass it to you for some remarks.
Well, I'm very happy to be here. I have been asked to talk about how I came to write the book, what the challenges of the book were in comparison to my other books, and maybe tell you various things that never got made it into the book for reasons that will become apparent when I talk to you about writing the book. And I should also say that if you look at my books, it may not be apparent from their titles, but it would have been more apparent from their subtitles. I mean, almost all my books in some way or another are either set in, or a part of them are about New York City. And if you have actually read Urban Forest, you know that quite a bit of it, is about New York. It's sort of counterintuitive, but it ended up being the case that really, the most impressive urban forestry program in America, and I mean maybe possibly worldwide, is in New York City. So how did I come to write this book? So I had written a couple of books that my husband always refers to as the Bummer Beat. The first one was the history of the South Bronx, which the first edition came out in 1986. And I mean, for those of you who've lived in New York a long time, I mean, the South Bronx for a while was sort of the poster child for urban catastrophe. Then I got really interested in American drug culture as a result of doing the book on the Bronx. And I was a journalist. I had gone to Columbia Journalism School. I had worked at a couple of daily papers, and then I ended up getting a book contract for the South Bronx book. And I should say I've never had a regular job since. I think I may have been one of those really early work from home people long before there was Zoom. Anyway, so I went and got a PhD in American history, and my dissertation was about the history of American drug culture. What I discovered from writing these two books is Americans are not very interested in failure. These are two failures for a variety of reasons. So the era of American history that I studied and that I really loved and just found so much fun, and I felt it resonated a lot with the early 20th century, late 20th century, early 21st century, was the Gilded Age, the last Gilded Age. And so the next three books I wrote, I consider my trilogy of Gilded Age epic engineering. So the first one is about Thomas Edison and his system of DC electricity versus Nikola Tesla and Westinghouse and AC. So that, I will say, remains my most popular book, in part because of the Tesla car. When people look up the Tesla car, they find my book. And actually a number of movies and documentaries and stuff have made out, because it is a truly fantastic story, including the first use of the electric chair in New York State, at Auburn State Prison. So that, and then the second one was about the coming of the Pennsylvania Railroad into New York City, building of what are the Amtrak tunnels, Penn Station, Long Island railroads. And then the third one, though it may not seem an American epic, is about the building of the Eiffel Tower and the Paris World's Fair of 1889. So as Conquering Gotham came out in 2007, I was already, your books are usually finished a year before they come out. So in 2006, I was finished Conquering Gotham. It came out in 2007. Therefore, I was already working on my Eiffel Tower book in 2007, in the fall, when I was invited by someone who really liked Empires of Light to their Clinton climate change dinner. And I, meanwhile, had been thinking about what was I going to do when I finished with the Eiffel Tower book, and really the third book I'd written that was about the Gilded Age. And that also features Thomas Edison at great length. And I mean, it's hard to have not felt any time in the 21st century that climate change, what we call the climate crisis or the climate catastrophe, just was the pressing issue of our time. And so I wondered, what does someone like me do? What kind of contribution, meaningful contribution, can I make? And I thought, well, what do I do in life? I mean, I write these narrative nonfiction books that are very accessible to the public. I mean, and I should try and do something of that sort. And the thing that I had thought for a very long time is, like, we're having this big carbon problem. Why are we not on a big tree planting binge? I mean, to me, that seemed like a very simple worldwide project. So when I got invited to this Clinton climate change dinner, I had a friend, he's still my friend, but at that time he was working at the World Resources Institute, and their entire purpose was to address climate change. So I called up my friend Rob, and I told him I was going to this, fancy dinner that I'd been invited to. And, not because I knew anything about climate, but, because the person hosting it I guess, thought it would be interesting to meet someone who'd written a book he liked. So I said, I feel like, trees are important, and I should think about writing a book about, urban trees, because I mean, my thought in this is most people in the United States, 80%, and the majority of people, like just over half worldwide, we live in cities. And as cities warm up, like, what are you going to do about it? You basically have to do something about the heat island. And there's a very limited number of things you can do. And trees are a really significant thing you can do. And they have all these other, additional benefits besides cooling things down. So I go off to this dinner, and I go, like, I learn a little bit, but Robin basically tells me that, when it comes to climate change and trees, people sort of roll their eyeballs and, nah. But anyway, so I go, and I have to tell you, it was a very tiny dinner. There were 40 people there, and one of them was Jane Goodall. I was not sitting at the same table as she was, but I was sitting next to Charlie Crist, who had just finished being the Republican governor of Florida. So there are all these very fancy people at this table, all of them sort of heavy hitters. I then introduced myself. No one has ever heard of me. And I said, well, I'm working on a book on trees. They're like very unimpressed as they're talking about going to Davos and that sort of thing. So that is how I started working on this book. And honestly, I knew nothing about, I actually knew enough about trees to know what an oak tree looks like. I knew, like, my trees reasonably well, but I didn't know anything more than that. So one of the first people I got directed to is Mark Biscayno, who runs Casey Trees. He still runs Casey Trees. He was the urban forester at the U.S. Forest Service. Then he became the urban forester in Washington, D.C. In 2006, he took over Casey Trees. Casey Trees it started with a $50 million endowment, which is unheard of, from Mrs. Casey, the widow of a real estate billionaire. As you can imagine, their endowment is a lot bigger than that. And there was always this idea that, well, other people would be inspired by this, and every city would have an incredibly, well-endowed urban forestry nonprofit. Well, that's still not true. But in any case, so Mark just he sort of gave me the lay of the land, and he gave me this long list of people. And he said, if you start talking to all these people, you'll get this figured out. And one of the things I came to realize is that many cities had nonprofit groups that were very specifically focused on urban forest. So as I went along, I came to realize, very typically when I write a book, there's a chronology, and I like to work chronologically. And then there's, the important people and the important organizations. So the thing that was really challenging about this book was that the cast of characters was not only, people. So, you'd have a David Fairchild, who was the USDA's first explorer in chief. This is a fantastically interesting man who figures in my book. And then you have the USDA, or you have the New York Botanical Garden, where, their entomologists identified the American chestnut blight. So you have these organizations. That's very standard. What was different in this book is you also had an arboreal cast of characters, meaning that there were these trees that had really significant histories and played a big role in cities. So, it was a real surprise to me as I got into this. I knew about American chestnuts, sort of knew that they had disappeared, but I thought of them as very Appalachian. So when I looked into this, one, I did not realize that the blight was identified very specifically at the New York Botanical Garden in 1904. And, this fruitless, expensive effort was made to, stop it, because we're Americans and if we have a will, we're going to launch a battle and, we're going to defeat this thing. Well, forget it. Um, but but actually it turned out that most American cities had tens of thousands of American chestnuts, which are really consequential, important trees in, like an ecosystem, unlike oaks, which have mast years. So, an oak will make not that many acorns many years in a row, and then they will make massive numbers of acorns. American chestnuts very consistently uh, produce the same number of chestnuts. So there were American chestnuts, and then there was the elm, the American elm. Well, the American elm was the canopy tree in America once Americans got committed to the idea of having a canopy. So, that was, so there's this entire world of trees and which trees are important and what are their histories. So that's another layer. And then there were the cities. So, I mean, certain cities play a really important role in sort of the overall history of urban forests. And that was another thing I had to figure out. And there's on the East Coast, the city of trees is Washington, D.C. On the West Coast, it's Sacramento. In between, there are quite a few American cities that bill themselves as a city of trees. So I sort of had to figure out which cities were worth writing about. So, and then there were the bugs. There were the bugs. We were just discussing before we got on the spotted lanternfly that is, I guess, made itself pretty visible in New York. So each of these bugs you had to, learn about. Then the thing that was really challenging. So I was a journalist. I like done a lot of journalism, but I hadn't done any journalism in at least 10 or 12 years because I had been writing these history books. And it was very easy for me to organize the way I proceeded to learn what I needed to learn because again, as I say, I like to work chronologically. So I would start with the beginning and move forward. Well, this book just did not work. That was the timing issue was just a huge challenge for me because trees trees operate seasonally. And then there are these activities related to trees that if you wanted to report on them, you had to be places. And there were all these different cities. So just scheduling my time was really hard. I live in Baltimore, so I'm 1 hour from Washington, D.C. At that time, my parents were still alive and they lived in D.C. And obviously I was writing about Washington, but one of the things I came to realize is that the Japanese cherry tree, that's a tree I, spent a lot of time writing about because it's a tree that in Washington, it's like the biggest tree worship festival we have in this country. And 1 million people come to Washington in the spring to see the cherry blossoms. I never made it in all the time I was working on this book to be in Washington when the cherry blossoms were going full out because there's too much going on in the spring. And, I'd say, okay, I'm going to go down and see the cherry blossoms this week. Well, they wouldn't have bloomed. So there's no point in going. Or the next year, it's like, oh, they already bloomed. They bloomed early. So now this is not good. And then another time I came up, I went to a great deal of trouble to organize coming up to the Bronx because the Million Trees NYC was putting in a tree that was, like the 900 and there was like 10 trees away from some major thing. And the mayor was coming, the whole thing. So, and I should stop and say here, New York City, the nonprofit that functioned here was Bette Midler's New York Restoration Project. They were the nonprofit partner to the city forestry division. And the really great thing about the New York Restoration Project is never did they have an event that did not come with a celebrity. So, so this always made it very interesting to go to their events. The very first tree that was planted, and I have a photo of this in my book, a big bird was a celebrity. So the first tree planted in, which was also in the Bronx, and I should also say, I learned this a little investigative reporting because I went to actually find, go and look at this tree. It's like, okay, first tree planted. I'm going to go have a look and how's it doing? Well, in fact, it had died because they planted a silver bell, which is a ridiculous tree to plant as an urban street tree. So it had died and they planted something else. But in any case, I then got the photos from that, and it turned out Big Bird was there, as well as the entire cast of Wicked. So I go up to, attend this event. I've made a special trip to New York. I've arranged some other things. I get up there, and as I'm on the subway and going to the Bronx, this is when people still read newspapers in the subway. I see this big headline. There's been a cop shooting, blah, blah, blah. I get up there and the whole thing is canceled because it involves all these politicians. And I mean, I understand this, but there I am. So, these are the kinds of things that, you plan these events and they fall apart. The other thing I found myself doing with this book. So, as I said, I've written quite a few books now, and I have this calculus in my own head, which is how many sentences, paragraphs, or pages is this research going to generate? So if I think not much, I try and proceed accordingly. Well, because I just knew so little about this, and it was so hard to know in advance whether what I was spending all this time and energy doing was going to generate something important. I did a lot of stuff that never made it onto the page. And a perfect example was another New York Restoration event. I thought, okay, I should go to Arbor Day in New York. This will be perfect. So off I go to Brooklyn. This is yet another visit. And very satisfyingly, the celebrity of the day was Glenn Close. And you don't often get to, meet Glenn Close and hear her talk about trees and, her own lifelong love of trees and climbing trees and so forth. The other thing about this, I found the entire thing actually pretty hilarious. It was in, a perfectly nice park. This is actually long enough ago that, Brooklyn was, less gentrified. And but it was this unbelievably orchestrated event. I mean, the New York Restoration Project goes all out. And the guy organizing the event was the guy who organized the Christo Gates events in Central Park. So we're talking like very high level event organizing. And every child, you arrive and there are all these tents that look sort of like a Hamptons party. And this is Arbor Day in New York City. I found all of this very funny, but in the end, I just never could find any place to put it. And then every child, and these are just like these, local elementary school children arrive and they get these bags of swag that, again, would have been perfect at some Hamptons garden party, like little trowels and little aprons to wear when you gardened. And, it just, the whole thing was kind of ludicrous. Anyway, so that I felt like, boy, this is really Arbor Day, a certain sort in New York that this is never made in. Anyway, so these were the challenges. And the further challenge is that consequently, I could not write the book sequentially. Like if I went someplace, I had to write, I had to write that while it was fresh. So instead of starting with chapter 1 necessarily, I did that. The history stuff I by and large could write in order. But as I got to the later stuff and it was all being reported, that ability ended. So I would find myself writing chapter 19 when I hadn't written 14, 15, or 16. This became a real problem later. So anyway, I noticed I have been speaking for 26 minutes, and I believe that was I'm 1 minute over my allocated time. So I think I've given you the general drift. The one last thing I will say is never in my life was I ever late with any book. This was the third book I did with my editor at Viking Press, Rick Cott, and my Eiffel Tower book was so easy and so much fun. I got it in a year early. Anyway, so I was just blowing by these deadlines. And in January of 2016, I like Rick hadn't heard from me for quite a while. He called me up and he said, "So Jill," and I had given him, he'd seen the fair amount of the book. He said, "When are you planning to get your book in?" And I said, "Well, I was thinking I probably can get it all done by this fall." He said, "It is going to be published this fall." This is January. And normally, as I say, there's a year. And I mean, it was like that. That's the way it's going to be. So it was a mad scramble, and I was getting galleys back as I was writing chapters, which is not a good feeling. So, I mean, I think the final thing I'll say is that of all the books I've ever written, I have never felt more reluctant to release the manuscript than I did with this. I mean, in the end, I think I was happy with it, but it really felt like just too ripped out of my hands. So that's it. And I'm happy to take any questions.
Wow. Thank you, Jill. That was fascinating. I didn't know that at the end there you were like right up against the timeline. So I want to give all of you a chance to ask as many questions as you'd like. So this is the point where you can either use your raise hand reaction, which should be under reactions at the bottom of your screen, and one of us behind the scenes here will ask you to unmute. If you prefer me to read your question, you can throw it in the chat at any time. And I think I saw one in there already. So let's start there. So Kathleen said, "Hi, Jill. Thanks very much for your book. Have you ever decided to stop one of your projects?" Ooh, that's a good question.
Yes. Very quickly, I once had an idea. It was actually a bad idea to do a book about 4 different Gilded Age Titans. And I got as far as actually writing a book proposal, and I don't know, I was told by my editor and the publisher, like, "Oh, this is a great idea," but nothing ever came of it, and that was actually good. So
So that time it worked out. That's interesting. What else? Any other questions? Feel free to raise your hand. Oh,
So Jill, you talk about all the expertise you needed to bring together, historical knowledge of trees. Did you have consultants? Did you have botanical people in the tree world read your book for
yes.
accuracy? I'm saying
Yeah,
that.
I mean, I do. That is a really, it's important, I mean, I always say to people, I am not a tree expert. So, and in fact, one of the things I did want to mention, because I don't know how obvious this is, but I was, as I mentioned, I started knowing nothing, and I was well along when I went to a nursery on the eastern shore of Maryland, Moon Nursery, to meet Matt Stevens, who is head of putting in the street trees in New York. So just to convey what happened in New York City when they decided to do the million trees. So it's very a typical city plants anywhere from sort of 5 to 10,000 new street trees a year, right? I mean, you lose trees all the time. So, I mean, the reality is, let's say you lose a few thousand trees, you're putting in 10,000 trees. I mean, that's not a huge shift. New York went from planting 10,000 street trees a year to 100,000. I should know. They went from planting 10,000 trees a year to planting 100,000 trees a year. Now, in the end, I think about 250,000 of those were street trees. So knowing that they were going to be operating at that scale, they got rid of the middleman because, as Matt Stevens said to me, you would spend all this time choosing, like a judicious selection of what you should have, the right ones for these. And then, you'd go and you'd say, well, I'm here to pick, oh, well, actually, this range of sort of 100 species that you were expecting us to deliver. No, we got 10. So, so they cut out the middleman and they contracted directly with 3 tree nurseries, because to get that many trees that far out, they really had to have it lined up. And one of them was this tree nursery. So I went there, never been to a tree nursery, just, thought it was all really enchanting. And I'm, driving around with one of the people who works there, and they have 200,000 trees there. I mean, that seems like that's a lot of trees. And I said, oh, so how do you grow these trees? And he said, well, they come from Oregon. And I was just amazed. I said, what do you mean they come from Oregon? So the street trees of New York City start their lives in Oregon, and they grow for a couple of years, in this case, in a place called Schmidt's Nurseries, which sells 1 million trees a year. And they don't sell them the way we think of them. They sell them as quite small, and they sell them as something called bare root, because, obviously bare root, that's light compared to anything. So they come east when it's cold in huge numbers, and they get put into these nurseries, and then they spend a few years growing in the nurseries. So a typical street tree can be like 5 to 7 years old by the time it's, in the ground. And, one of the things I did, and I allude to it very briefly, I went to Schmidt's Nurseries, and it was such a mind-boggling place. The scale at which they do, you have to do 100 different things to a tree to get it to the point where you can put it on that tractor trailer and send it where, to these wholesale nurseries. So I mean, I just was so amazed at that. But it was, this is where being under the gun really took a toll, is I literally didn't have the room in my head to think about this, sort it out, and tell this story in a coherent way. So it's just like, nope, not doing that. But anyway, so and Schmidt's Nursery is not the only one, but they really focus on urban trees, and they take a lot of pride in what they do, and they're very famous. So interesting, I'll just tell you this. I happen to be doing this Zoom from Boston, where my daughter is, and Matt Stevens, who was head of this street tree program there, and I think acquitted himself very honorably, then went to San Francisco and was head of the Botanical Garden. And if any of you have been to San Francisco, the Japanese tea garden, special favorite. And lo and behold, I found out from Nancy Bewley, the woman who is always out there promoting Schmidt's, that he's here in Boston as the CEO of Mount Auburn Cemetery. So on Monday, I get to have a tree tour at Mount Auburn Cemetery. So this is the perks after the fact of meeting all these tree people. I just have to say that this also, meeting the tree people was so interesting to me, because this is a group of people. I mean, I know tree people. They're just such a great group. I mean, and what do they want to do? They want to go look at trees. So it's, you guys you're like doing the right thing. You're tree people now, right? It's a good place to be.
Yeah, that's a great point. Doesn't hurt to plant more trees. I'm gonna jump.
In some way be connected to them.
Yeah, and we talked a lot, I think, last week, kind of about just storytelling too, and just sharing how you connect to trees can inspire others to want to be connected to trees. I'm going to jump around here a little bit. Kathleen, I see your hand is up, but let's Lois asked, how do they decide which trees they are going to choose for New York? I don't know if you know the answer to that one.
Well, I think as you know, you all know, there's a big push for natives. So I think that's, that's a big issue. And then, after the disaster of the American elm, and then followed by the semi-disaster of the Bradford pear. And I don't know how much any of you know about the Bradford pear, but it became, the beloved urban tree of the 1970s, acquired a certain size, and the branches began to just randomly crack and fall off onto cars, onto pavements. There are many people who feel they stink. I don't feel that way. And then they just went rogue. I mean, it's interesting, trees will come from someplace, they'll sort of behave themselves for many decades, and all of a sudden they become invasive. Yeah. So the Bradford pear has really taken off, and people are not happy about it. But yeah, I mean, a lot of thought goes into this, and I think it's also how much can they tolerate, what is their form, just the need to have variety. I mean, many Midwestern cities, especially, and then in places where there was a lot of development, heavily planted with American ash trees because they were cheap and grew plentifully. And then comes the emerald ash borer, and that's that. So part of it is just to try not to end up in that place again where all your trees are vulnerable to whatever comes along. Yeah.
Yeah, I definitely agree. There's a big push to just diversify the canopy to prevent another catastrophe like that again. So I'll go to Raymond's question. Jill, you've ended up studying strategies for focusing public interest on trees in the urban forest. What would you say is the most underappreciated strategy, or what strategy do you think we need to see more of now?
You know what I think it's just, in a way, almost public service messages. I mean, we live in a very balkanized time in terms of connecting with people. But one of the things I was saying when I was, talking to our hosts here before we did this, is that one of the consequences of working on my book, and I will say my agent and my editor suffered the same fate. I cannot walk down the street anymore without being horrified by the terrible things being done to trees, often, with their best interests at heart. But there's so much, it seems to me, that people could learn through very simple public service kinds of messages. And I don't see any consistent effort to get those out there. So, I mean, one would be the whole issue of English ivy. Most people have no idea that English ivy is a bad thing and should not be allowed to proliferate on trees. Another is people have this idea that building boxes for the trees and filling them with soil is a kindness to them. This is not true. Watering, I mean, I just think that when we have these really long periods of really hot, dry weather, that just going outside and, pouring a cup of, I mean, every time, like, you walk out of your house, I mean, thinking of New York now, you come out of your apartment building, there's your tree, your beloved street tree. It just would be a kindness, to give it some of the water from the ubiquitous water bottle that everyone carries around. That and it, for a long time I was trying to find out, is it a bad thing for dogs to pee on trees? It turns out it is. So, that's probably another thing worth knowing. But I mean, it seems like it's not that hard to plant trees. It's really hard to care for trees, for people to water them enough. And I don't know, maybe that's not strategy enough, but I guess that's mainly what I can offer.
Yeah, and I think that's Ray is in the Forest for All coalition, and I think, that's something we talk about a lot is getting the message out sometimes is half the battle. So all great points there. Couldn't disagree. So I'll go over to Kathleen. I'm going to ask to unmute.
No, thank you. I just quickly, Jessica, at Madison Square, don't you have a tree well where you're testing urine resistant plants?
Yes, we do, but
You do, right?
that is for perennials. It was
Right.
a 1-year trial.
Right.
So as dog urine is not good for trees.
Right.
We have proved that it's okay on some native perennials that had pretty good resistance to
Uh-huh.
dog urine.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
more to come on that.
Yeah.
That's the whole aspect of like trying and learning, and we'll
Yeah.
see where that goes. But thank you
Right.
for bringing that up.
Right. No, but I just wanted to say, Jill, throughout your whole book, regardless of who you were speaking, you really demonstrated people's ongoing connection, emotional connection to trees. And I think, we hear a lot about coastal resilience. We hear a lot about, instead of green infrastructure, gray infrastructure, but that emotional connection, the way you spoke, you always touched on it. And I thought that that was one of the best lessons of your book, that people have had this emotional connection forever. And
Yeah, I mean, I have to say that in the course of writing that book, I mean, I really came to value, just getting outside and spending your time in the presence of trees. And that can be as simple as, walking down the street that has a decent canopy. I mean, honestly, for me, I'd really like to be in the woods, and I feel very, very grateful because Baltimore has a lot of pretty woody parks, and it's not that hard, to be in them. So for me, in any given day, I would really, a better day is if I've been in the woods. And that wasn't something that I really sort of sought out when I was younger. So I think that, for me, that was a great lesson. And actually here in Boston, the Arnold Arboretum, which certainly features in my book, I hadn't been in it for, a while. And I went to see a friend who lives here, and I hadn't realized that she literally lived down the block from the Arboretum, because I sort of I don't have myself situated here. But I mean, it was just this fantastic feeling to like come, and it's like, I said, oh my God, we're at the Arnold Arboretum. And they're doing a really interesting thing here, which is, of course, I mean, all over the East Coast, we're losing big trees because it's a very human, whatever, settled landscape and cityscape. And, they're not that old. I mean, the trees are 100 years old, 150 years old, 200 years, if you're lucky. And they're coming to the end of their natural life. So the sort of level of tree loss, I think, has been high, and it just goes on because we're now just in this period of, the senescence of these sort of original trees. So the Arboretum seems to be taking their trees that are keeling over, and they're turning them into these very beautiful kind of lacquered wooden benches. And people, I imagine people get to spend a very large sum of money to have their names put on them. But they're all over the Arboretum, and I thought, what a great use of the loss of the trees. And they all have, I think, their original tags on them, so you can see, they all have dog tags. And those are embedded in these benches, so you see that this was, something from, I don't know, 1906.
No, it's nice.
Awesome. So Richard, I will ask you to unmute.
Hi, Jill. Hello.
Hi.
I don't know if you remember me, but I actually got to interview you about 5 years ago when your book first came out at the Natural History Museum in Los Angeles.
Yes, among all the tigers.
Yes. Brett, we sat in the
You were
hall
looking familiar to me, but you
Yeah.
know, you never know. Well, that's
Well, when
are
I
you
saw
in New York?
I am actually now, and thank you for talking about tree maintenance, because that's obviously a big part of what I do. I'm at the High Line now.
Oh my
So
God, of course.
if you can grow, and we have many trees growing in 18 inches of soil, 30 feet in the air. So I have great respect for trees, and I'm fortunate enough to actually live just a half a block from Central Park now, and
Mm.
it is a cathedral that I walk in with my dog every morning. We don't pee on trees, thank you very much. But it's amazing, the foresight and the Avenue of the Elms and all. And I love that someone spoke about the emotional connection. So I think one of the questions I actually asked you 5 years ago was, what those of us that were lucky enough to grow up with trees in our lives as kids always have some sort of an emotional connection to some tree. And I just wondered what yours was, if you have one.
I grew up all over the world. So honestly, the tree at this time that I have, whenever I see it, I always, have a very good feeling, is a very old American elm that is in front of a car repair place. And I drive up and down a particular street all the time. And one day when I was driving up and down this street, I noticed there was one of those notices that on a tree that is like the little death sentence. And I had, gotten involved with trees in Baltimore, the Baltimore Tree Trust. And it so happened that right after seeing this, I went to Silburn Arboretum, which is our very modest, everything in Baltimore is very modest, because we're, really a poor city. Whenever I go somewhere else, I mean, I'm here in Boston where there's so much money, you just think, oh my gosh, we are so poor. In any case, we had a brand new arborist, so he was, not beaten down yet. And I said, why is that incredible American elm, in front of blah, blah, have, this death sentence on it? I said, it looks fine. Now, I should also say that this is the classic example of, you look at this tree and you think, how is this tree not only alive, but gigantic? Because it doesn't even have a tree pit. It just has, this huge trunk and then cement, like right up to the roots. But, obviously it's found some source of water and sustenance. I mean, it's like really a gorgeous tree. And it's an American elm. So the next time I saw him, which was pretty soon after that, because, just a lot of tree stuff going on, he said, or he might have even sent me an email, said, that tree is not coming down. And, it's that standard thing, the people at the garage, they found the tree inconvenient. They, complained about it to the city arborist who was in charge of their district. And he was obviously some total jerk, because he was like, oh yeah. So every time I drive by this tree, I feel like, oh, look at that. Because it is one of those really huge special trees that the cityscape doesn't have a lot of. So for me, I'm very attached to that elm, and I feel very proud of the fact. I mean, to me, it's one of the most major things that I did. I mean, that, that isn't really true, because there are entire sections, neighborhoods in Baltimore that have been planted up because of this nonprofit. But that tree always has a really special place for me. I think if you save a tree, that feels good. Well, I congratulations working at the High Line. I hear it is the #1 tourist destination in New York.
Number 4.
No.
Statue of Liberty, Empire State Building, Central Park,
Oh,
and the High Line. Yeah.
okay.
Just
Well, you're very honest.
5.5 million visitors this year, down from 9.5 million in 2019. So
Right. Well,
yeah. And do say hi to Matt Stevens for me. I was up in Palo Alto for a couple of years and worked on a committee with him, and was very happy to see that he was landing someplace that I need to visit, which is the Auburn Cemetery. Is
Yes,
supposed to be
see, I've never
amazing.
been there either, so I'm excited about this. In fact, I'd never been to, is it Greenwood? Is it Greenwood Cemetery?
Greenwood in Brooklyn,
In
also that
Brooklyn.
came up
See,
today.
so
in a
I
talk
went
was
there with the lovely man, the quixotic environmentalist, because he had planted American chestnuts there. The other thing he does is he puts mussels in the harbor. Oysters, mussels, something in the New York harbor. You know, it's I think there's a million oyster project.
The oyster oyster
Yeah.
project.
So right, he was also part of that. Anyway, it seems all to the good.
Well, I'm just happy to see the book getting some additional love.
Yes.
So
Great. Wow, love this. Old friends reconnecting over good books. Really nothing better. Well, we literally only have 8 minutes left. Lois, I saw you had a great question about you were wondering about trees planted on streets and trees planted in parks like Madison Square Park, Washington Square Park, Bryant Park, Central Park, all those. Is there a difference in choice in, I'm guessing, in selecting those trees? Jill, do you want to comment on any of that? I can comment on the park side.
Just street trees need to be of a certain size, especially in a place like New York. I will tell you again, the intrepid reporter, that one of the one of the many New York Restoration Project things I did was way up in Inwood, and they were had a zillion volunteers, and off we went, and they planted this area of the park that turned out to be sort of a party area. The neighbors were not happy about this, and they basically wanted to be planted up so that people couldn't gather there. So we planted all these trees, but they were tiny. I mean, they were like a gallon. They came in gallons, so they were not big. And a few years later, I thought, well, I'm just going to go back and have a look and see what happened. Well, surprise, surprise, what happened is the people who liked to party there came and pulled all the trees out, which was not hard because they were tiny. So, the size tree you plant matters. And it also sort of matters, what people, I mean, I have encountered this a fair amount, actually, at this stage, having been involved in trees. Let's see, almost 20 years, let's just say 15 years. As sure all not everyone loves a tree, and they especially don't love it if it's interfering with what they view as, the normal usage of wherever they are. So, what you plant really matters for that reason, like the size of it, where it is, kind of whose world it's changing, and whether they like that. In fact, actually, one of the funniest things I went out on several occasions to what I don't know where they are these days, but the New York City Forestry had an office way out near, wherever the World's Fair was out there in Queens. And they showed this video of a woman. So someone had planted the street tree in front of her house, and she was really against it. Now, she wasn't going to actually rip it out or cut it down because she knew this would get her in trouble. But what she did is at night, unaware that her neighbor was filming her, is she went out and she dug it up and she poured in some noxious something and then, put it back in place. And then, of course, the tree died. But she was, in fact, she had committed arboricide, and they had it on film because her neighbor wanted the tree. She didn't want the tree. So anyway, I will let you talk about planting trees in parks, because that is a whole different thing. Don't plant 1 gallon trees.
Yeah, man, you must have so many crazy stories about trees, and way more than I have. But I will just comment on Madison Square Park in particular. So we are a public-private partnership with the Parks Department. So they do own the land, but we are essentially like the stewards of it. So since we raise 100% of the funds, we have our own arborist, urban arborist that comes to take care of our trees at a very, very intense level. And with Bill Logan from Urban Arborist, sorry, we wrote this tree conservation plan, which I will put in the chat now. And basically, it's kind of the outline for what we want to do with the future, because a common problem in parks is a lot of these trees were planted at the same time, and a lot of them will age out at the same time. So how are we going to prepare for that? So my first year here, I think we planted 5 trees my first year, 2021. Yeah. So pretty much, if we have to take a tree down due to disease, it's dangerous, something like that, we always replant, maybe not in that space, but somewhere else a tree is added. And in here kind of has our plan for which trees we'd like to add. So, I think the next one we'd like to add on our list is a sassafras, which we don't have in the park.
Oh,
Which
great tree.
Yeah, right. So we're all of us here are very excited about it. So we take it as an opportunity to, make sure we're planning for the future, and that Madison Square Park will always have a very beautiful, lush canopy. So that's Madison Square Park. Just depends on the park, what their agreement is with parks and all that. There's so many layers to all of those things. But I did just want to ask one final question to Jill, and that's just simply kind of what's next for you. And I think that will wrap it up.
Well, I'm still working on, promoting my South Bronx book. But honestly, actually, I had a very unusual childhood. My father started working as an economist with the Marshall Plan in Switzerland in 1948. And he continued on working with what eventually became USAID. So we lived in a lot of places, and I have come to realize that we were sort of on the front lines of the Cold War. I mean, so were tens of thousands of other people working for the US government. But, I actually find a lot of this stuff very funny. I mean, there's sort of the serious side of, oh, he was there. And as a historian, I realized I grew up I moved from place to place. And as an adult of, advanced age, I just realized I really don't know what was going on in those countries when I was there, with the exception of Vietnam. My father was in Vietnam during the height of the war, as was my mother. They were both there. So in December of 1968, as the height of the war, I went to Vietnam for my Christmas vacation. So, which is ridiculous, but, and some fairly ridiculous things happened. But of course, that was a, tragic situation. So there's sort of this combination of, serious global issues, and then, the natural human comedy. So I'm interested, in doing that in part, to understand my own. You sort of reach a point in life you think, I wonder what that was all about. So I'm hoping I can pull that off. Maybe not. I had thought, I had intended when I finished this book to write another tree book, but in case any of you have not noticed, there have been like a tsunami of tree books. So I thought, honestly, the world doesn't need another tree book. And it took me quite longer than I expected to finish the Bronx book, because COVID came along as I finished it. So I had to then write a COVID afterwards, which prolonged the whole thing by, a couple of years. So, so that's my current thought.
Awesome. That's great to hear.
Yes, a total swerve. Total swerve.
Love it. Well, out of all the tree books, we still decided on yours. It was great.
Oh, that's very nice to know.
Loved
A
it.
lot of
Loved
New York
reading
in the
it.
book, so that makes sense in a way. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, with that, everyone, I hope to see you next week. I will
Yes,
send it.
I'm hoping to make it back. So
Oh, good.
yeah.
Thanks.
I'm interested in what the Nature Conservancy is doing.
Awesome. Yeah, and Emily Maxwell will be with us, and you will get a chance to ask her questions about the urban forest. So I hope you all can join. And again, I will send you a reminder on Tuesday with the same link. And with that, have a great night. Thank you so much, Jill. Again, this was wonderful. See you all next week.
Yes, thank you so much. It's great. Bye.
Bye.